This is the Learn Jazz Standards Podcast, episode 65.
Welcome to the LJS Podcast, where you get weekly jazz tips, interviews, stories, and advice for becoming a better jazz musician. And now your host. He's a jazz musician, author, and entrepreneur, Brent Bardstra.
All right, what's up, everybody? Brent here, the jazz musician behind LearnJazzStandards.com, and you're listening to another episode of the LJS Podcast. I'm super glad you're here listening, especially those that are regular listeners. I really appreciate you coming week after week, and a warm welcome to those listening for the first time. I know you're going to get a lot of value out of this show. This show's all about helping you become a better jazz musician, and if you've been listening to the show for a while, as you know, I like to have a special guest on whenever I can because they offer a different perspective, they offer a certain kind of expertise. And in this week's episode 65, we're talking about how to create killer jazz solos by thinking like a composer. And I've got a really special guest on the show today. He is a Downbeat Magazine Award winner and a 3-time recipient of the ASCAP Young Jazz Composers Award. His music has been featured in films and advertisements by CNN, NASA, Visa, Intel City Group, many different companies. This is Jeff Schneider, pianist, saxophonist, and composer. You can check him out at jeffschneidermusic.com. His last name is Schneider. And we'll have the link to his website on the show notes today at learnjazzstandards.com/episode 6565. So be sure to check that out there. But before we get started and get Jeff on the line, I just want to say, as I always do, if you'd like to give back to this show because you get value out of it, be sure to go to iTunes, leave us a rating and review. That just really helps other people find this show. We super appreciate it in advance. Really thank you for all that help. All right, now without further ado, let's get Jeff Schneider on to talk about building awesome jazz solos by thinking like a composer. Here we go. All right, welcoming on the show today is pianist and composer and saxophonist Jeff Schneider. Jeff, thanks for being on the show today, man.
Thanks for having me, Brent. Good to be here.
Yeah, for sure. And so, a lot of my listeners right now, they probably don't know who you are. So why don't you give us the 2-minute who is Jeff Schneider bio?
Okay, well, I do many things at the moment. As you said, I'm a composer. I also play saxophone and piano and a couple other things and produce a lot of tracks. But for the most part, I am composing music for film, advertising, and television, as well as producing beats and that sort of stuff. Teaching how I do all of that online. So I have a YouTube channel where I make a bunch of instructional videos, kind of breaking down some of the more advanced things that I do. So it's accessible for everyone out there who wants to learn. And as I said, I'm teaching a bunch, and my philosophy there really is, if anybody wants to work hard, I believe that they can learn the stuff that I do, because I think a lot of people watch the music that I make and kind of watch the way that I make it and think it's really kind of out of their league. But I'm convinced that it's possible for anybody to get it down. And I say that because when I was coming up learning how to play the saxophone, it wasn't until I really started to practice a lot that I actually noticed that I was getting better and making any progress. Up until that point, I was just kind of like being pretty much idle and not showing too much improvement. But once I really started to work, that's when all the good stuff started to happen.
Amazing. So what kind of stuff have you done? You've said you've done commercials and stuff. What kind of companies have you worked for?
Yeah, so I've worked for everything from everybody from NASA to CNN to American Express and BET. I mean, really all over the place. Gatorade. So it's been really interesting because when I'm composing for those kinds of jobs, it's music in all different genres. So everything from really commercial stuff, stuff you'd hear like jingly type of things, and then background music and hip hop beats. I mean, it's all over the place, which makes it really interesting and a lot of fun to work on.
Now, you have a really strong background in jazz. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about maybe if you had any formal training or what kind of your history with that is as a jazz musician.
Yeah, so I actually started on piano, not necessarily with jazz, but I started learning piano by ear, which was kind of like a great a great sort of setup for my jazz
Oh,
education
yeah.
because, as you know, so much of playing jazz and really all music is an ear-based practice.
Very
But
much so.
once I started playing saxophone in middle school, that's when I really got interested into sort of the classic big band recordings like Glenn Miller, and then I got hip to like Charlie Parker in high school, and that's when I started studying with this amazing saxophonist out of New York City named Will Vinson, who still plays and is
Yeah,
amazing.
Will. Oh my God, Will Vinson. Yeah.
That's ridiculous. So he really like set me off on he showed me what was up, like who to check out, what they were doing, how to practice, all that good stuff. And then, as I said before, that's kind of when I really started to practice and start making some progress. From there, I did the Manhattan School of Music, prep school in high school, and then I went on to New England Conservatory for my jazz performance degree, and then I did a composition and arranging master's degree at UMass Amherst. So I've been in school for a while, but I'm out of it now, and now I'm just trying to pay it forward and kind of show everybody what I've learned along the way.
Amazing. And so that just goes to show that you're more than qualified to talk about today's topic, which I'm super excited to have you on to talk about today, which is essentially how to improvise compositionally, how to think about building our jazz solos or our improvisation, thinking like a composer. And you're obviously just an amazing composer and an amazing musician. So I'm excited to talk to you about that. And I want to start by just asking you, what do you think makes a great solo? Maybe structurally, maybe emotionally. What in your mind makes a really exceptional solo?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a tough question because it's really subjective. But
Sure.
to me, I think a great solo is one that takes you somewhere. It's one that you kind of get wrapped into as a listener. And if you ever find yourself listening to a solo when you kind of tune out, I think that's sort of the opposite of what a great solo might be. Similar to if you were listening to somebody speak, like doing a speech or a presentation or something, and you tune out from that. If you're not following along and you lose your attention, then someone wasn't ideal with their presentation or their speech. And I think the same goes true for a jazz solo or any kind of solo. But as I said, it's very subjective. So what might keep somebody's attention is different from another person. All that being said, for me, again, it's taking somebody on a journey. It's creating something that's not just random notes, but something that's really concrete and melodic in a way, and contains all the elements that a great composition would contain.
So on that note, what's your approach to composition outside of soloing, perhaps? If you're sitting down to write a piece for a project or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the most important thing is melody, and I can't state that enough. I mean, it sounds kind of obvious, but it's something that gets forgotten. And the same is true for even if you're just writing a chord progression. If you're writing a chord progression and you're playing chords on a piano or on guitar or arranging for an orchestra, and it's just chords, there's still a melody there, and you can just say, oh, it's the top voice of each of those chords. But it's important because that has to do with voice leading and how the chord progression sounds. Because you can play the same chord progression two different ways and have them sound very different. So that top note, that top voice, which leads the melodic line, is so important. And if you are actually playing a melody or composing a melody, to construct something that makes sense, that has balance. There's so many techniques that go into making a good melody that we can get into. But I think the number one thing to keep in mind for composing is to not lose sight of what is happening melodically.
Right. So now when we come to improvising with this stuff, how do we improvise melodies? Because, like they say, improvising is kind of like composing sped up, right? You're doing it on the spot. You're flowing with wherever the music is going. How do we get to this point where we're able just to improvise really great melodies?
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? It's and I think you're absolutely right about the thinking about improvising as just sped up composition or spontaneous composition. And I think that the trick is, first, you have to not put yourself in the moment for a second and slow down and see if you can actually just compose a melody. Like if you can't compose a folk song, like a very simple kind of a folky nursery rhyme type of a tune, then it's going to be really hard to do that on the spot on a bebop solo or something,
Oh, that's
when you're
point.
in the moment. So to kind of stop things and slow down and just make sure you can do some very basic composition is super important. Because that's, as you said, that's what improvising is. It's that sped up composition. So if you're not thinking about it in that way, I think that's gonna hold you back in terms of getting your solos to actually sound like they could be considered compositions, which I think is ideal.
Yeah. So that idea of, I thought that was really interesting. You just said if you can't improvise, a folk tune, or like a folk melody, you can't improvise like, some crazy bebop solo or something like that. Is there a place is there like a project or like something that listeners today could take away and work on specific to that, like maybe a call to action?
For sure. I think that giving yourself an assignment to write a folk song can be extremely effective. And the way to do that, I would say, is to sing something, because when you sing something, you're going to have the most direct connection to whatever it is you're hearing. One of the problems that happens a lot with instrumentalists in improvisation is how easy it is to just put your fingers down on the instrument and the notes come out. And when you're singing, you are having that direct connection to what you're actually hearing versus just pressing your fingers down and kind of, hoping that the notes that you play sound good. So the first step I would say is to sing, just to make up a folk song and sing something that you might be able to get a 5-year-old to remember. I think that's a good approach. You want to create something that a child could sing back to you. And that's going to help you keep it simple. That's a big, big takeaway right there. Keeping it simple. Because if you're playing or you're making up something that's really complicated, you're not setting yourself up for success there in terms of composing a folk-like tune. So, if you're familiar with like the pentatonic scale, for instance, that's a great scale to use for composing folk songs. So many of the folk songs out there use that scale. But again, it's not about thinking about those notes and just pressing your fingers down on pentatonic notes. It's about getting the sound of it in your ear and singing a song that maybe uses those notes and creating lines that relate to one another. So I'll give you an example.
Sure.
If you take a line like this, I'm going to use. Let me see if you can hear this. Can you hear my piano here?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to play 2 examples of a line, and I want you to tell me which one sounds more like it's the end of a song. All right, here's the first line. And then here's the second line.
Right.
So this one sounds like the end.
I definitely have to say the second one does.
Of course, right. And the reason for that is because the second one ends on the tonic, ends on the 1, or the first note of the scale. And the first line that I played ended on the 5. And those 2 notes have different feels. They feel different. One has a little bit more resolution. One has a little bit more open-endedness or tension. And you can manipulate that when you're composing or creating these folk-like melodies. When you have a note like the root of a chord or the tonic or the first note of the scale, that's going to sound very much resolved versus anything else is going to sound less resolved. So that's what I'm talking about when I say creating a melody that has balance, where you have one line that maybe is more open-ended and then one line that is more closed, just like when you would ask a question and then receive an answer.
All right, just taking a little break from today's show to talk to you about our flagship ebook, Zero to Improv. Zero to Improv is a book that teaches you how to become a great jazz improviser from the ground up. No stone is left unturned. This isn't your ordinary music book. Zero to Improv, it calls you to action. It's packed full of improv and jazz theory lessons. You'll start from the beginning and build up all of the skills and knowledge that you need to become a great jazz improviser. There's audio examples included for all of the music notation in the book, and versions are available for C, B flat, E flat, and bass clef instruments. It's designed for all skill levels. If you want to learn more about Zero to Improv, go to zerotoimprov.com. That's www.zerotoimprov.com. Now my brain's like bouncing everywhere from a lot of things you said. There's a few different records I want to go in, but first let's back for a second to talk a little bit more about singing. You know, I think it was, I really was struck by the fact that you said it's all about this melody and it's all about being able to sing these melodies, because, you know, I get emails all the time, people asking me, well, what scale do I play over this? Or, you know, how do I, you know, navigate this 2-5-1, you know, what's a tritone substitution, all of these things. And what you're saying to me right now is focus on being able to sing a melody. Okay, now how do we? I'm gonna put you on the spot here. How do we hear melodies? Because that's sort of another level right there. How do we start hearing melodies in our head? You know, we can't just come out with these out of nowhere, right? Where do they come from?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I've been doing this a long time in terms of teaching people how to do this, and whenever I get somebody to actually commit to singing something and just singing a simple line. You know, we've been listening to melodies our whole lives, whether it be nursery rhymes or the radio. So I think we have a natural inclination to how these melodies are supposed to go and how to create something that has a beginning and an end. And if you do need a little bit of inspiration, I think looking to, again, folk melodies and kind of getting that primed in your head, but also, you know, some classical music is going to have melodies that are laid out really clearly, and you'll be able to hear, you know, that sort of call and response thing that I was talking about before. And I'd also like to mention that, you know, you were talking about how people are writing in, asking about, you know, things about scales and modes and tritone substitution, all this crazy stuff. And I totally get that, because I get the same questions. But, you know, I think about people who write songs that go on the radio, you know, pop songs and things like that, because that's a genre that I live in sometimes when I'm writing for different brands. And when I listen to these songs, you know, I'm listening and I think, wow, there's some great melodies here. You know, yeah, I might not you know, pick that over like a John Coltrane tune or something, but you know, there are melodies on the radio that these pop these pop bands are writing, and I don't think they know what tritone substitution is. You know, they're not like playing Cherokee at 300 beats per minute, but they can write a great melody. And the reason for that is they're singing these songs, they're singing with lyrics. And that actually makes me think of something. If you are having a tough time coming up with a melody, put some like pretend lyrics in there. Take you know, go to a random Wikipedia page and like sing the whatever words pop up on the page, because when you start thinking about lyrics and words and things like that, that can really help ground you in some concrete melody generation.
Right. That's a great tip. Thanks for sharing that, Jeff. You know, and I'm also thinking at the same time, I'm thinking about I have a course called 30 Days to Better Jazz Playing, and a lot of the students comment one of the assignments is to learn Miles Davis's solo on Freddie Freeloader off of the album Kinda Blue. And it's just incredibly simple and melodic, right? It's almost as if he is, you know, playing a folk melody over top of that blues form there. And that's something that everybody always, you know, comments to me about. They're like, I can't believe how simple this melody is that Miles is playing, and yet how it just floats over the form and it sounds so good. I think Miles is a great example of someone who just plays real beautiful, simple melodies like that. Would you agree with me?
Absolutely. And that solo is just amazing. And every time I listen to it, you know, like you said, it's a great example of some improvisation that is simple, but is also extremely effective and interesting to listen to. And part of the reason for that is his phrasing is just unbelievable. The way he plays those notes, and that's also one of the benefits of approaching improvisation more compositionally, because that might mean that you play more simple lines, especially at the beginning. And when you do play more simple lines and you don't have to worry about all of those fancy scales and the tritone substitution and whatnot, you really get to slow down and focus on the phrasing, which makes such a difference. I mean, you can take the same line and play it so many different ways. And if you really listen to that Freddie Freeloader solo, the phrasing that he uses is just amazing. Every time I listen to it, I hear something new.
It's impeccable for sure. And really everybody on that album and that song especially is just amazing. And it's making me think a little bit about, how when we're, some of our favorite songs, they're telling amazing stories. Or even if you think about other arts like film, some of our favorite films, I mean, they're obviously telling brilliant stories, and there's a progression to those stories. And so I know that we should talk about this, because we're talking about playing simply and phrasing and all this stuff. A lot of times some maybe more amateur improvisers are tempted to kind of come out of the gate just swinging, right? Just going for it, and maybe forget about the development side, about actually building and creating a solo. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that process and thinking like a composer in that way.
For sure. When you start a solo, I think so much of getting a good start is developing your ideas. And a lot of times this is referred to as motivic development. But really what it is writing a good melody from the get-go. And some really basic ways to start doing that. I think the most effective word to keep in mind is repetition, is to repeat yourself. That doesn't mean you have to play something verbatim the same way multiple times, but to take an element from what you just played and repeat it. I use this example a lot with my students, taking this old classic.
Right. Minuet in G, right?
Exactly. Minuet in G. And the two phrases there have the same exact melody. Bump, ba 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 bump, 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 ba 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 bump, bump, bump. But the notes and the pitches are obviously different. But that's a great example of using something that you used before. In this case, it's the rhythm, and then changing another element, like the pitches. So you can repeat pitches, you can repeat rhythms, you can repeat the way you play something, like the phrasing or the articulation. You can repeat the shape of a line. If the line goes up, you can play another line that goes up after that, or down and down. There are so many different ways of developing a line that you play, and the main thing to remember is repetition. And you can't do this enough. I think one of the issues here is that when people repeat themselves, they think that, well, they sound repetitive and boring. But the thing is, to a listener, if you repeat yourself, it gives the listener something to latch onto. It gives the listener to say, "Oh, I've heard that before. I get this. Like, I understand what's happening." Now, if you're too repetitive, you get what I call expectation syndrome. I don't call that, actually. I just made that up. But we'll call it that for now. So when I say expectation syndrome, I mean where you repeat yourself so much that the audience is like, "Oh, I know what this person's going to play next." It's the same with speech.
Right.
Sometimes you hear somebody say the same story over and over again, and you kind of get it, and you know what they're going to say. But at the same time, if you have too much surprise, which is kind of the opposite of expectation, then you can lose the listener there. That's where maybe you're playing things that are too all over the place, and you don't have enough repetition. So you have to find a balance there of having sort of expectation on one hand and then some surprise on the other. And in order to create that expectation, you repeat yourself. And in order to create that surprise, you can break the repetition. But that word right there, break, is very important, because that's essentially breaking the pattern. You establish a pattern with repetition, and then you break it to create the surprise.
Well, and there's this idea, like if you've ever had a conversation with someone who just is a crazy talker, right? Won't leave space between what they're saying, and they go from idea to idea. I'm thinking of a particular person right now in my head that just really hard to follow this person, and it's a lot of interesting information. They know a lot of stuff, but it's hard to follow. It's almost you feel exhausted when you're done that conversation and you haven't even hardly put in a word yourself. There's no repetition there. It's just kind of a barrage and assault of words, and we don't want our solos to be like that. And one other thing I'd add that you said, Jeff, is with repetition, there's a difference between just repeating, like, for example, some more amateur improvisers as well become lick players sometimes. Like, I learn a lick, and that's good. That's a good part of your education, to learn licks and, try to build some vocabulary up. But then, that idea of just, every time a 2-5-1 comes up, I got this lick that this pet lick I'm going to come out and play with. That's kind of like the bad repetition we're talking about. But the repetition you're talking about is, again, this motivic development, this taking a particular idea and morphing it to the different situations that it's in, right? Just kind of building off of that. So, repetition is great used in the right way. You know what I'm saying?
For sure. And that's a great point. You want to shy away from seeing the same chord progression and then playing the same lick over it again and again. That's not the kind of repetition we're talking about, right? It's
because then it sounds forced.
What's that?
Then it sounds forced.
Exactly. Then it sounds forced. The nice thing about actually doing this approach where you are focusing on developing your ideas via repetition is you kind of get away from that lick mode, because you're focusing on what you played before rather than the lick that you memorized 3 weeks ago. You're staying in the moment more, and you're actually making music that's more appropriate for the situation. And more specifically, if you play something and then you kind of sing back to yourself what you just played, that will help you create your next line so that it has to do with the line you played previously. Sort of an analogy that I like to make is that old game telephone, where you something into somebody's ear and then they whisper it into the next person's ear and so on. And over time, the first phrase evolves, and it evolves gradually, and you can kind of trace the progression from point A to point Z. And if you think about developing a solo in that way, I think it can be very effective in creating something where everything ties in together.
Now, is there, when you're thinking about taking a solo or, and again, tying this into even being a composer, is there an arc that you're thinking about? Like, is there a certain climax that you hit? Is there a part where you come down? Like, is there any of those elements you think about, or not so much?
Well, yes. I don't always think about one particular arc, as in, one with one real big climax, and then the rest of it is like building up towards that climax, and then the rest of it is coming down from it. What I usually think about is, am I staying in the same mode too long? And I'm not talking about like a scale mode like Mixolydian. I'm talking about like the quiet mode or the loud, exciting mode. If you're in one mode or one gear or something, like if you're driving a car, if you're in one gear for too long, that's an example of too much expectation. So if you're ever talking to somebody, you feel like you're losing their attention, you might want to, speak up a little bit and get louder, and then suddenly their eyes light up and they're back. Or maybe you want to talk really quiet, and then suddenly they're leaning in a little bit closer so that they can hear you better. Right. And those kinds of arcs where you're coming up dynamically and then going back down, or playing more notes or playing fewer notes, that's what's going to bring people in. It all comes back to that expectation and surprise. If you're doing the same thing for too long, you get monotonous. But if you're changing it up too much, then you're all over the place. So in terms of that arc that you were talking about, I usually think about multiple arcs. I'm thinking, okay, do I feel like my audience is zoning out? Do I need to do something different here to create a more effective solo? And that's kind of how I am crafting those changes and those shifts in my playing.
As we close out here, I'm just curious to hear maybe what some of your inspirations are in the jazz realm specifically, as far as soloists that really you feel think in this mindset, this compositional mindset.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Keith Jarrett is an amazing developer.
I would agree. Yes.
I'd also say Joe Pass, and the reason for that is, well, his music, but also I saw a video of him a long time ago where he says something like, if you can't sing back what you just played, it probably wasn't worth playing in the first place. And that really ties into what we've been talking about today. Also, Charlie Parker, even though he plays a ton of notes, and this is a great example for our conversation here because we've been talking about, playing very simply and making these folk tunes. And then, I don't want your listeners to think, oh, I don't want to be soloing, playing folk tunes the whole time. But the thing is, once you're able to do that, then you can kind of graduate to another level where you're incorporating more notes while keeping that same level of composition in your improvisation. And Charlie Parker is a great example. If you take a look at the tune Confirmation, for instance, that one.
Oh, yeah.
Right, that line right there.
Yep.
Or that whole song, rather, has motivic development in it. It's a little bit disguised. You have to look for it, but it's in there. So that I don't know if that's coming across with my less than great singing here, but if you examine that melody, you're going to find little bits and pieces that are repeated over and over again, and that could be another a more in-depth conversation for a later date. But
sure.
Even Charlie Parker, who's playing a million notes per minute, is developing his lines, and there is composition within his solos. And I think that's a great point because I don't want people to be thinking, I don't want, that they have to play folk songs in their solos. It's not the case. It's just you have to be able to do that before you go to the next level of incorporating more notes.
Right, and I think that's a great assignment for this week. If any listeners want to take up on that challenge, is go listen to Confirmation by Charlie Parker and listen to just the melody and see what you can find in there that is repeating itself, this motivic development, and then even go further into his solo and try to identify how he's developing that solo, even in that, of course, intense bebop sense. That's a great assignment to do. And Jeff, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, you just gave us an incredible amount of value, and I really appreciate you taking the time. Is there anywhere we can send listeners today to go check more of you out?
Sure, definitely. You can check out my YouTube channel where I do a bunch more instruction and play some of my music. That's youtube.com/Jeff Schneider Music.
Awesome.
I also have my website, jeffschneidermusic.com, and Instagram, Jeff Schneider Music, and I think my Twitter is jschneids music randomly, but I think that should keep everybody out there busy enough. Definitely YouTube and the website for the latest, as well as Instagram.
Awesome. Everybody go check out Jeff's YouTube channel and all of his social media. And Jeff, again, thank you so much for being on this show today. We hope to have you back soon.
It was a real pleasure. Thanks so much, Brent.
All right, that is all for today's show. I want to thank you so much for listening. And remember, you can find today's show notes at learnjazzstandards.com/episode 65. And you can find a link to Jeff's website and his YouTube channel there. And I got so much value at today's show just from talking to Jeff. I hope you got a lot of value too. And if you continue to listen to this podcast, there's plenty more where that came from, and plenty more guests coming your way, sharing their expertise. Really excited, and be sure to come back next time. Remember, if you got value out of this episode, go to iTunes, leave us a rating and review, or whatever podcast listening service you use. Leave us a rating and review. That really helps us out. Be sure, if you've never become a part of our jazz community, sign up at learnjazzstandards.com/newsletter. Join our jazz community. We'd love to have you. Now, next week, we're going to be coming out with episode 66. I look forward to seeing you back then.
Thanks for listening to the LJS Podcast, brought to you by LearnJazzStandards.com. Subscribe to the series on iTunes, and don't forget to join our jazz community at LearnJazzStandards.com/newsletter.